Hi, my name is Paul Hafner with a new tip tutorial from cgcookie.com for the Max Cookie section. And in this tutorial, I'm going to show you a quick and efficient way to model filigree, high detail filigree, like the shape that you see here, which will serve as an example and also a reference for us to create our shape from. So the first thing I'm going to do is enter my front view using the F key, and I'm also going to toggle this grid here using the G key. Next I'm going to go to my shapes and create a line, but before I start clicking out my spline, I'm going to show you the difference between corner and Bezier drag types. If I start clicking out a spline in my corner drag type, you'll see that the segments in between the vertices are simply straight lines, no curves or anything like that. As opposed to the Bezier mode, which if you are familiar with Illustrator or any other vector programs, you will know what a Bezier curve is, but I'll show you what it is. I'm going to click, and while I have my mouse clicked, drag my line out, unclick, drag, click, and as I click these lines, I'm going to make the basic shape of my filigree right here. Okay. Almost done, and I'm going to start on this shape as well. And as we start these out, they don't have to look perfect. At this point, I'm more worried about the placement of my vertices in order to capture this shape correctly and get the right amount of detail in here, rather than if the curves actually look good, because we can go back and edit those later. So I'm going to put in the vertices I need, and we're almost done. And it's going to ask me if I want to close this spline, since I clicked very close to the place that I started, but I don't want to. So I'm going to click no. Now we're done with these shapes. We can go back in here to our Modify tab, expand our line, go to our vertex, and we can start modifying these curves. So whenever I grab a vertex, you'll notice right away my Bezier handles, which will control the angle and shape of these curves. Another thing that you'll notice is that as I move this Bezier handle, the opposite Bezier handle will move accordingly. And that's because this Bezier edge is simply in Bezier mode. But for these corner pieces right here, these corner vertices, I'm going to switch that mode to a Bezier corner. It's going to allow us to individually adjust these Bezier corners independent of one another, which will allow us to achieve that shape a little bit easier. Okay. So I'm just going to adjust these guys, and you can see how easy it is to modify these shapes as opposed to doing this spline in corner mode, where you would have to click a million times to get enough vertices to get these shapes right. So in Bezier mode, you have much more freedom to create the shape that you want with less vertices. Okay, so the rest of this is pretty much just drone work. So through the magic of online tutorials, I already have a spline ready exactly the way that I want it. So we're just going to move that next to it here. So this is after I've adjusted it the way that I want, and I've gotten the shape exactly the way that I want it. The next step in this process is in our rendering tab in the Spline modification stack. You're going to check this box, Enable in Viewport, and what that's going to do is actually create a mesh along this spline that you can see in the viewport, and it's going to give us that shape. Now there's a checkbox above Enable in Viewport, which is Enable in Renderer, and it pretty much does what it says. If you want to keep this shape as a spline, but you want it to show up as a mesh in your render, you would click that button. But we don't need to worry about that right now. Another important checkbox to remember is the Generate Mapping Coordinates. If you intend to unwrap this model in the future, this checkbox is extremely convenient. What it's going to do is cylindrically unwrap this shape that you've created along the spline. So you'll get a perfect cylindrical unwrap, and you don't have to worry about unwrapping it later. So always remember this checkbox as well, but we don't need to worry about that one right now either. Underneath of those guys, you'll see that we have a few more modification options. We have the thickness, which will affect the thickness of our spline. Number of sides, we can modify as well. And the angle that those sides are oriented. So I'm going to go ahead and zero out the angle by right-clicking on that spinner. I'm going to set my sides to 8 for this particular model. I'm going to set my thickness also to 8 for this guy. I'm also going to turn it on for this shape as well, which is already set up correctly. And I should also mention that since we used Bezier corners on this shape, we have an option over here called interpolation. And what that does, you'll see as I scroll up and down this value, it's just going to add or decrease the number of segments in between each vertex. So you'll add or decrease the number of, or the level of detail in your model. So for these guys, I'm just going to set it to 15 for each of these guys. There we go. And I'm also going to move them in front of our reference. And maybe change the color, just to separate them from the reference a little bit. Okay, the next step for me, I'm going to collapse these guys into editable polys. Okay. Collapse this guy. And you'll notice that one difference between the splines that we've created and my reference is that this guy has a little bit more character due to this variation in line weight, which this one does not have. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to add that variation. It's very simple to do. All I'm going to do is figure out where the epicenter of the weight variation is going to be, which I think is right around here. So I'm going to grab those vertices, and I'm going to turn on my soft selection. Now you'll notice that as we increase and decrease the fall off, not only are the vertices on this curve being selected, but also on this inner curve right here, and we don't want that. So what I'm going to do is turn on the edge distance checkbox. And what that's going to do, I'm going to set it to 100. What that's going to do is exclude this curve here from being selected, because it's going to, instead of calculating the shear proximity to these vertices, it's going to calculate the proximity based on this shape to these vertices, which is what we want in this case. So I'm going to increase my fall off just a little bit. And by the way, setting this value to 100, all that's going to do is allow my fall off to go a little bit farther. So once I adjust this and I get my fall off about where I want it, I'm going to go ahead and put a push modifier on top with those vertices selected. And what a push modifier does is calculate the average normal of these vertices or faces in relation to the vertices or faces around them, and it's going to either push or pull them based on this value. So as I increase it, you can see that we're adding a bulge and a little bit of weight variation to this curve, which is what we want. So once I have that where I like it, I'm going to collapse this to my shape. And you'll get this warning message, but you don't need to worry about that. Just hit yes. Next, what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring out this center curve a little bit, because I think that it should come outwards a little bit more for this particular shape. So in this instance, I'm going to grab this edge, loop it, and again I'm going to turn on my soft selection with my edge distance set to 100. Increase my fall off a little bit more. I'm going to move this edge forward like that. And that looks pretty good. And at this point we're nearly finished. One more thing I'm going to do to cap off this loop, I'm going to add a sphere in here, right in the middle. Okay, right in there. And place it right in here. And maybe squash it a little bit. Okay. Move it into position. And of course change the color to match. And one last thing that I'm going to do to this mesh, I'm going to take away these hard edges. It's a subtle change, but it makes all the difference in adding a little bit of realism to this high detail model. So to do that, I'm going to grab the edges I want, loop them, and I'm going to throw on a chamfer, add 5 segments, and decrease the amount to where I like it. That looks good. And I'm going to add it to this shape as well. Loop those edges, throw on my chamfer. Okay, and there you have it. That's really all there is to it. And you can apply these techniques to really any filigree shape that you want. I would advise using a reference when you're creating your shape, just because your modeling task will go much faster. It's a lot harder to create these shapes purely out of your head. So that's really all there is for me. Thank you for watching.